Skeptics beware! This video about Noah's Ark will change your mind.
That's the title of the most popular video from Answers in Genesis Canada, currently sitting at 3 million views. And right away, we have an issue. We didn't even make it past the title, and we already have a problem because the title itself gets the entire concept of skepticism wrong. As a skeptic, I'm always open to new information that would change my mind. So if this video could deliver on its promise, I would love that. But Answers in Genesis doesn't understand what it is to be open to new information. In order to work there, you have to agree to a statement of faith declaring that you will only believe new information if it aligns with the Bible, and that science comes second to Scripture. So they're necessarily using the label of skeptic here as if it's a bad thing. Now, of course, it is possible that the people over at Answers in Genesis are just simply being antagonistic towards skeptics and warning them against watching this video to imply that their disbelief in the flood is due to some sort of atheist dogma. That would also align with claims they've made in the past. But beneath every one of their accusations that atheists and skeptics and biologists are all dogmatic is a confession that they don't know how non-dogmatic thinking works in the first place. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to lie about what famous scientists say in order to try to convince us to follow our leaders out of reason and into the very pseudoscience that we spend our lives fighting against. So I'm much more inclined to go with my original impression that these people simply don't know what they're talking about when they use the word skeptic. But hey, maybe the video itself has something to offer beyond what's expected given the tarnished and slimy reputation of the organization that posted it. Let's find out. Welcome back to Reacteria.
The idea of a man building a giant boat to rescue humanity has been the subject of much interest, scrutiny, and ridicule throughout human history. And Noah and his ark have been represented in many different ways over the years. But what did the ark really look like? Does the Bible shed any light on the size or construction of the ark? How would it compare to the ships we have today?
This is a great way to start the video because we actually have an answer for that question from the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham, and it doesn't look great for the ark story.
People in the early 1900s built an extraordinarily large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way. And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, loss of all 14 hands. So there were 14 crewmen aboard a ship built by very, very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding. And they couldn't build a boat as big as the Ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable? The best shipbuilders in the world couldn't do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do.
That really is the biggest question of most of this video. What would you have to assume in order to believe that a 500-year-old man and his tiny incestuous family were able to accomplish more with simple tools and zero training than the best engineers in the entire world? You'd probably have to assume that they were simply superhuman. They were smarter and stronger and just all around better than anyone alive today. So much so that they were able to overcome the mechanical limitations of lumber itself in order to do something that would justifiably be considered impossible by any rational person today with the help of supernatural forces that we can only speculate about. And if you think that's a silly straw man argument, boy, you are not going to like the rest of this video, and that's exactly what Calvin Smith says.
All of these questions and more will be answered as we explore the Genesis account of Noah's Ark. The account of Noah and the Ark is one of the most widely known events in the history of mankind.
So is Star Wars, by the way. Lots of people all over the world know at least something about it. There's movies and books and comics and cartoons, and funny enough, it contains just about as much truth as what you'd expect to find in Genesis.
Unfortunately, like other Bible accounts, in this day and age, it's often taken as mere fairy tale.
In all fairness, it occurs directly between the story about the talking snake and the story about the tower to heaven, so Yeah.
However, truth, as they say, can often be stranger than fiction.
In 1937, a man named Joseph Fliglock was sweeping the street in Detroit when a baby fell out of a 4-story window. He landed on Joseph, and both he and the baby were relatively unharmed. 2 years later, in 1939, Joseph Fliglock was sweeping a different street in a different part of Detroit when a different baby fell out of a different window and landed on him, leaving both him and the baby relatively unharmed. That's what we mean when we say truth is stranger than fiction. Not magical adventures in soggy genocide with history's least qualified zoologist.
For Bible-believing Christians, the Bible is the true history book of the universe.
A history book with a talking donkey in it, mind you.
And it's in that light that the most asked questions about the Ark and the flood of Noah can and should be answered with authority and confidence. And if we're to answer the critical questions of the day, let's make sure we're doing it from what the Bible actually says, not versus some straw man argument or popular misconception of the day.
Just going to throw this out there. Calvin Smith, of all people, encouraging you not to rely on straw man arguments and common misconceptions is very funny. Remember, these are the people who try to paint science as just another belief system, who only reference real scientists with misleading partial quotations, whose every mention of evolution is a straw man or a misconception, whose entire argument hinges on logical fallacies like the false dilemma and the God of the gaps, all while arrogating themselves as the only arbiters of truth because the Bible is inerrant and their interpretation of the Bible is the only correct one. That's the organization that Calvin is representing here when he tells you to be fair and sincere in your analysis of his mythology.
For example, most people will often confidently dismiss the account of Noah's Ark by simply stating there's no way Noah could have fit all the animals on the Ark. And yet, when you ask them how many animals were needed to go on board, or if they know how big the Ark was, they'll often plead ignorance, but then still reiterate, but there's still no way he could have done it. Which shows that they probably have some misconception about Noah's Ark and haven't thought through it deeply at all.
Credit where it's due, I've been watching Calvin for a while now, and he is really good at winning arguments against the hypothetical atheist in his head.
Let's dive into this and get more specific, and let's begin with this question. Just how large was Noah's Ark? Well, unlike the many more whimsical drawings that often depict the Ark as some kind of overgrown houseboat with giraffes sticking out of the top, the Ark described in the Bible was a huge vessel. It was so large, in fact, that it wasn't likely until the late 1800s that another ship was built that exceeded the capacity of Noah's Ark.
I already showed the clip about the Wyoming, so it's not really worth reiterating. Instead, I just want you to stop and ask yourself here, what information did he just give you? He's trying to convince you of a claim by giving you relevant information. So what relevant information did he just convey? Did you perhaps hear him say that the Ark is so big that it took until the late 1800s for another ship to be built that was bigger? Because that isn't what he said. Listen again.
It was so large, in fact, that it wasn't likely until the late 1800s that another ship was built that exceeded the capacity of Noah's Ark.
It wasn't likely until the late 1800s. He really said nothing. He's trying to convince you that this Ark is real, but he doesn't have any data to go off of here. So what he said is that it was probably so big that it probably took thousands of years to make something bigger. And he made sure to say that word likely relatively much faster than the rest of the sentence, where he really slowed down his speech at the end, with good pauses, to make sure that the message he wanted you to hear sunk in. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but as an educator and a professional communicator, word choices and speech patterns like that absolutely have an effect on the listener. And especially when you represent a multi-million-dollar multinational corporation with a whole team of writers and producers and whatnot, they are rarely accidental. It may seem trivial to you, but to me, little things like that matter.
The key to understanding just how large it was comes directly from the Bible's account of God's commissioning Noah to create this huge craft. In Genesis 6:15, we read, "The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits."
Earlier in that same chapter, Genesis 6 and 7, God says that he's going to destroy all humans because he regrets making them. It's only in the next verse that he then decides to spare Noah and his family. Quick question, how does an all-knowing entity feel regret? Regret pretty much definitionally implies an unintended or unforeseen circumstance. If God really does know everything, past, present, and future, wouldn't he have known that he would be in this situation and maybe take some steps to avoid it? Because if he knows everything and he knew that this would happen and he let it happen anyway, then this sounds a lot less like a necessary judgment because the world was just so wicked and God had no choice, and it sounds a lot more like God just wanted to drown some people, so he did. Or if this part of the Bible is true, and this was something that caused God to regret, or my version actually says the word repent, so much that it gave him no choice but to take violent, drastic action, then that means humans did something that God didn't anticipate. And if we're able to operate in ways that God doesn't expect so much that it forces his hand to flood the entire world, then he's not really all-knowing, and he's not really in control, is he? I guess what I'm really asking here is, was it possible for God to have created a world in which he didn't have to drown children? And if not, why? And if so, why didn't he? And either way, why are we calling this character the good guy?
Now, the word cubit, the primary unit of measure in the Old Testament, isn't one commonly used today. So understanding the length of a cubit is the key that gives us a good indication of the size we're talking about. The length of a cubit was based on the distance from the elbow to the fingertips, so it obviously varied between ancient people groups. But when Noah came off the ark, only one cubit measurement existed, the one that he had used to construct the ark.
Ah, yes, Noah, master of the seas and governor of the prime cubit.
Now, the exact length of this cubit is unknown due to the effects of the Tower of Babel, where people scattered from one another and began using their own cubit.
Just for clarification, the flood ends in chapter 8, and the Tower of Babel happens in chapter 11. According to Answers in Genesis, that was just around 100 years after the flood. So in just 100 years, Noah and his family, just 4 men and 4 women, had enough children to populate the entire earth. They had so many babies in such a short amount of time that those babies were able to grow up, build a tower, and accidentally generate all the languages around the world. They were busy. What is that? That's 100 years times 12 months divided by 9 months equals 133 babies per woman, assuming all pregnancies are successful and they're just cranking them out back to back while on their back. So that's 533 babies from just those 4 families alone, plus probably a few hundred more from their horribly inbred children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You could build a tower with that. You just use their Habsburg jaws instead of bricks.
So it requires some logical guesswork to reconstruct the most likely length of the original cubit.
I'm just throwing this out there, fun little thought experiment. I want you to just imagine how Answers in Genesis would react to a clip of a biologist saying that all the information about some ancient creature or ancient lineage was lost, but we can use some logical guesswork to better understand the most likely scenario for evolution. They'd never let us live that down, but their whole argument here is based on their assumptions about the length of the forearm of a 950-year-old man from 4,000 years ago. That's what this video is talking about in this moment.
Most ancient cultures ended up with 2 cubits, an older or royal cubit, and a common or shorter cubit. Using an older cubit, which is the most likely cubit length in Noah's day, we can get a close estimate.
Okay, so we're not even guessing about the size of his arm anymore. We're guessing about which average arm length we should be measuring with.
One known and well-attested ancient royal cubit was at least 20.4 inches, so we know that the earth must have been no less than 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high.
So judging by an approximation of one unnamed culture's longer version of the average arm measurement recorded after the one unifying arm measurement that you referenced earlier was somehow lost, you can say definitively that you know the minimum dimensions of the magical floating prison zoo full of dragons from 4,000 years ago. Again, that's what they're putting in the video titled "Skeptics Beware, This Will Change Your Mind." I don't think they know what the word skeptic means.
Now, in the Western world, wooden sailing ships never got much longer than about 330 feet long. Yet the ancient Greeks had built vessels at least this size 2,000 years earlier. China built huge wooden ships in the 1400s that may also have been as large as the Ark.
Wow, that's 400 years before he said anyone probably built anything bigger than the Ark just a few moments ago. So we're guessing about the size of the Ark, but we think that this ship was around the same size, and we're pretty sure that nothing was bigger until much, much later. Meanwhile, we don't believe in evolution, the glue that holds all biological science together that we can see with our own eyes, because that just takes too much faith. Only at Answers in Genesis, everybody.
But the biblical Ark was one of the largest wooden ships of all time, even though it would be a mid-sized cargo ship by today's standards. But the common question for many skeptics and Christians alike is obvious. How could Noah have possibly built the Ark? To most people, the task of building the ship described in the Bible just seems overwhelmingly impossible. But again, before people dismiss the idea, they should look at what the Bible actually says.
Take note here that he is once again saying that we have to look at what the Bible actually says to answer these questions. And then he says,
You see, the Bible doesn't tell us with wooden literacy that Noah necessarily built the Ark all by himself. And as a matter of fact, the idea that he would have doesn't really make a lot of sense. When we see other accounts in the Bible, such as that Solomon built the temple, we don't actually believe he was the one doing the actual laying of every stone or building the physical structures himself, but that he designed and commissioned it to be built.
the Bible doesn't say that he didn't have help, so we can assume that he did. He starts his breath by admonishing us to pay close attention strictly to what the Bible says, and he ends that same breath by making a case for what the Bible technically doesn't not say.
Now, this isn't to say that Noah wasn't personally involved in the construction of the ark, but understanding that besides his sons helping, Noah could have hired skilled laborers or had relatives such as Methuselah and Lamech to help build the vessel. Noah could have had between 55 to 75 years to build the ark. So, except for the fact that you wouldn't want to have to go back and repair work that had been done too many years previously, there's actually no reason to believe that Noah and his sons couldn't, or that they didn't, build the ship themselves in the time allotted.
He could have hired help, and he could have had his relatives there, and he could have had a lot of time, and he could, and he could, and he could, and he could. And if you think that this is the bottom of the barrel of the arguments in this video, brace yourself, because it's about to go from lazy to gross real fast.
You see, despite what many might believe, there's no reason to think the physical strength or mental processes of men in Noah's day weren't at least as great as our own. There's actually compelling scientific evidence that the genomes of all living creatures are slowly degenerating due to the accumulation of slightly harmful mutations, which means the genetics of people in Noah's day were likely even far superior to ours today.
See what I mean? A Christian man talking about superior genes and a golden past. That's never been a problem before, right?
They certainly would have had efficient means for harvesting and cutting timber, as well as for shaping, transporting, and erecting the massive beams and boards required.
I'm going to give everybody a second to laugh at the word erecting, and now we're moving on.
If one or two men today can erect a large house in just 12 weeks, how much more could 3 or 4 men do in a few years?
I mean, he's right. I bet 3 or 4 men could make some really great erections in that time. Okay, sorry, now we are actually moving on.
After all, the Bible reveals Adam's descendants were making complex musical instruments, forging metal, and building cities. So their tools, machines, and techniques were not primitive. And history has shown that technology can be lost. In Egypt, China, and the Americas, it was often the earlier dynasties that built more impressive buildings or had finer art or better science than those who came later.
Of course! They had better art, which is a totally objective statement and not opinion at all, and they had better science, which is why we see all those ancient cultures that were landing on the moon and not dying of cholera all the time. It's going from ancient flood to ancient aliens so fast, and I just want to talk about biology.
For example, the ancient Maya were the first Mesoamerican civilization that built stone cities and astronomical observatories with a mastery of mathematics than the later groups like the Olmecs and Aztecs who came after them never surpassed. And we must recognize that many so-called modern inventions we have today are actually reinventions, like concrete, which was used masterfully by the Romans over 2,000 years ago.
Hey, Andrew!
Hey! Are we in the stupid part now? Okay.
It's
Got
always the stupid part. The whole thing is the stupid
Yeah.
part.
I'm ready. I'm Andy White. I'm an archaeologist. I work mostly in the eastern woodlands of North America. I've been doing this for about 30 years. Talking about pseudoscience and Atlantis and that sort of thing is not my day job, but it's a side hustle because I think it's important to get the human past right. So I like to take some time to try to do that and try to address some of the nonsense that I see out there, which is really, really interesting in a lot of ways too. So it has its rewards. I used to teach a course that I called Forbidden Archaeology, and I use it as a critical thinking class because anybody can make a claim about the past, right? They can say things happened in this such a way, and how do you know whose claim is more credible? Like you have to be able to sort through and evaluate evidence, and it helps to understand the history. And these ideas do not come out of nowhere. A lot of them have pretty long histories, pretty interesting histories. A lot of them have pretty ugly histories. So that kind of stuff is good to know. I think if you're gonna hang your hat on something, what are the tentacles of that idea?
So speaking of tentacles, what did you think about the video that I sent you from Answers in Genesis?
I was especially struck by the way he used the concept of degeneration, and he used it in two ways. One related to human physiology, and the other related to kind of human cultural achievement. And both of these things are threads that we see running through the history of thought from the Bible and other kind of contemporary mythological sources outside the Bible. Ancient Greece had a golden past. Ancient Sumerians had a golden past. Super, super common to have societies kind of make up stories about where the world comes from and how it got to be where it was and who created kind of order and perfection out of chaos, and that it's worse now than it ever has been. It leads in some really interesting places from there, and I'll put interesting in air quotes, into ideas about racial purity and the problem of mixing of races and how that leads to degeneration and eugenics and Nazism and white supremacy. So if you want to trace out those tentacles, like they are there, and they're pretty ugly, back in the Mediterranean and Southwest Asia, whenever the Old Testament stories were written down, whenever the Sumerian stories were written down, whenever the ancient Greek stories were written down about this idea, kind of a fall from grace. And the Atlantis legend comes from that same thing too. There's this perfect society, and then they did something wrong, and so destruction was visited upon them, similar to the flood, to kind of wipe all that away. And it's the idea that there was this perfect past that kind of describes the pattern of human history going from perfect to degenerated and declined and to less perfect, which really runs counter to everything that geology and archaeology and paleontology tell us about the long history of evolution and change in the natural world and in the cultural world. That doesn't follow that pattern at all. And it doesn't do the opposite either. It doesn't go from stupid to smart. I mean, in some ways there are threads that do that, but I mean it's really kind of this beautiful kind of chaotic mosaic of things that happen, and there are patterns, but it's not simple to complex or complex to simple or better to worse or worse to better kind of thing. So in some ways, I feel like they're kind of putting up a straw man there, and kind of proclaiming that this vision of the past is correct, even though it flies in the face of all of these other independent lines of evidence that we have, and it doesn't seem to bother him whatsoever. And this guy, misstated a couple of things that really bother me as an archaeologist also. He said something about the Maya had all this high technology and sophistication, and then the societies that came after them, like the Olmec and the Aztec, were like kind of worse than that, or they had like degraded. But the Olmec actually predate the Maya, and we know that from archaeology, and we know that there's an entire long sequence of cultures and societies that come before that go back thousands and thousands of years. And we know that from all over the world that we have these kind of common patterns of human societies, the way they change and develop and innovate things like agriculture and pottery and technology and complex social systems. When people see things like the Egyptian pyramids and they say, oh, well, they got worse as they went along and the civilization just came out of nowhere, that's incorrect. We actually know a lot about the precursors to that civilization, and they go back far, far in time. And if we would study those more, instead of just focusing on the fancy things like the pyramid, it would become obvious that this idea that all the good stuff is early and then things get worse after that is completely wrong.
I have frequently called Answers in Genesis a cult because they have really fucking wackadoodle beliefs. And they expect people to sacrifice so much of their critical thinking just for this insane claim that every word of the Bible is true. This is why they believe in dragons at Answers in Genesis. They believe that dragons and unicorns literally existed because those words are in the Bible. Never mind what actual biblical scholars say about, hey, that's not what those words mean. This is a mistranslation of these words. I'm wondering if that is a hallmark of this kind of thinking that's really universal, or if this is something that's they're accidentally falling into.
I don't know. Like it's such a common thread among the people who like these ideas for religious reasons. That concept of perfection, sin, corruption, degeneration, like that's clearly in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't get into specifics of like, so therefore your ancient civilization should look like this, and therefore Adam was this many feet tall. Like it doesn't say that stuff. Like that's kind of all invented afterwards. They put so much of their critical thinking like on hold, but yet they still struggle to fit things that are patently obvious facts about the world, like the idea that we do have remains of dinosaurs. So like, how does that fit in? Like it has to fit in somehow, right? So how are we going to fit that in? So you change the rules of the earth and you change the rules of geology and astronomy and everything else in order to make that stuff fit in. You create this world that doesn't follow any of the same natural laws that we know now. You have to throw your uniformitarian assumption out the window and just create something that's completely different. I don't think I'm answering your question. I think we're just having a conversation at this point.
No, it's a good conversation though, because like that's I struggle to know how to even ask the question, because it's really like there's clearly something deeply fundamentally wrong here. And it's not just that they want to believe the Bible is true, so therefore dinosaurs, dragons, right? I feel like that is a symptom. And the root cause of this is something a lot deeper. And I want to know what it is.
One of the things that strikes me a lot is there's kind of this fetishization of the alternative, the thing that is not real or that can't be proven or that seems like fancier. And like it's frustrating as a professional archaeologist, because the human past is really, really fascinating. We have been working really hard for a long time to try to understand it. We know so much more about it than we used to. After doing archaeology professionally for, say, 150 years at this point, you could almost excuse people back in the 1800s for some of the ideas that they came up with, because some of them kind of made sense with the facts that they had. We know so much more now. We know so much more about time and the bottom of the ocean floor and processes of domestication. And we have so much more information and a better understanding about processes of cultural change. And it's remarkable to me that people would still hold on to those same ideas. So I ask myself that same question, like, what is the appeal here? In a lot of cases, maybe it is religious, like they really just want the Bible to be true and they feel very, very threatened that people could poke 29 holes in the first chapter of Genesis and go, well, what about this? Well, what about this? What about this? And that's kind of how that video read. It was pretty defensive. Really, he's like, well, you guys might not think this is true, but here's why. And then there's like special pleading after special pleading after special pleading to tell you how this could actually be true. But there's a lot of non-religious people who just really want there to be some secret ancient lost civilization that they can figure something else out about that we aren't telling them the truth about. So there's like this conspiracy angle too. And, that cuts into religion also. There are some people who have a foot in both of those worlds, who want every single thing in the Bible to be true, also think the government is hiding secrets, also think that archaeologists and anthropologists are evil and we've got some kind of agenda. And, I don't know what you do with them. It's hard to have a conversation. I'm sure you are well aware of the difficulty there. But, I still think it's important to try to let other people know, like, we know this isn't right. Like this, it's just not right. It makes no sense.
Pseudo-archaeology and cryptozoology and all the other things that hold together the flimsy creationist arguments we respond to on this channel do indeed make no sense. But you know what does make sense? Taking control of your science education with Brilliant. Hear ye, peasants! I, Forrest, Lord of the Valkais, hereby decree that learning shall be fun and accessible. Or at least I would. But Brilliant already did it for me, I guess. Brilliant is an everyday learning app that puts the power of math and science right in the palm of your hand. They offer thousands of lessons in a wide variety of topics, from programming to circuits to calculus and Bayesian probability, all designed by an award-winning team of educators and researchers from institutions like Caltech and MIT. Once you get it, be sure to try their scientific thinking course to prime your mind to appreciate the scientific beauty of the natural world all around you. And here's the best part. They're offering my subscribers 20% off an annual subscription to Brilliant Premium, and all you got to do to get it is go to brilliant.org/ForrestValkai, click the link down in the description, or just scan the QR code on the screen. Let me tell you about this amazing deal. It's a really excellent opportunity. Double helix, more like double the fun when you download Brilliant and start learning math and science. That's pretty good. Swim on down to Brilliant and get straight into learn. But it's 1 in a million. So it's a 1 in a million app. Don't be a bonehead. Get Brilliant today. Look, I don't know what you want from me here. All right. I really think that you should download Brilliant. Can't argue with that one. You terribly miss out on a science lesson if you do. No, wait, no, don't over-rethink it. Get Brilliant today. Flex those science muscles. I'm actual size Forrest Valkai, and I'm as strong as your brain's gonna be if you download Brilliant. Like, I didn't think this one through. I just bought the costume. You're gonna learn all types of shiitake. Anyway, go to brilliant.org/ForrestValkai, or scan the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description. See you later, bye.
Even accounting for the possible loss of technology due to the flood, early post-flood civilizations would have possessed all of the engineering know-how necessary for a project like Noah's Ark. It's very reasonable to believe people were sawing and drilling wood in Noah's day, only a few centuries before the Egyptians were sawing and drilling granite. The idea that more primitive civilizations are further back in time is an evolutionary concept.
It is not an evolutionary concept. It's a flimsy straw man that you're hoping will hide the even flimsier straw man that you actually believe in.
In reality, Scripture says when God created Adam, he was essentially perfect, the best physically and mentally that mankind has ever been. Today, the individual human intellect and physique has suffered from 6,000 years of sin and decay. The sudden rise in technology in the last few centuries has nothing to do with increasing intelligence. It's a combination of publishing and sharing ideas, and the spread of key inventions that became tools for investigation and manufacturing.
This is such a lazy cop-out. Here in reality, publishing and sharing information and inventing better tools for investigation are all things that correlate with increasing intelligence. We become better investigators, so we learn more information, and then we publish and share that information so that the next generation can start where we left off with their own investigations. We see farther because we stand on the shoulders of giants. Meanwhile, people like Calvin see less because they believe in actual giants.
One of the most recent and widespread tools, of course, is the computer, which may make us feel superior somehow to our ancestors, but is likely quite needed now, as it actually compensates a great deal for our natural decline in mental performance and discipline, since it permits us to gather and store information as perhaps never before.
You know what, actually, now that you mention it, this is all starting to make perfect sense. You start with Adam, and he was an absolute beast. He was as strong as Hercules, and he looked like Jesse Jerdak, and he could run Windows 98 in his head. Then you've got Noah, who lived to be almost 1,000 years old, but he never learned how to swim. And then you skip forward to today, and we've all sinned so bad that we need autocorrect on our phones, and there's people out there who listen to Answers in Genesis. Finally, it's all starting to come together.
Now let's move on to one of the most common queries posed surrounding the idea of this floating wooden zoological masterpiece that almost always comes up, and answer this question. So how could Noah round up so many animals? And of course, you'll often hear a follow-up question after it, something like, are you saying Noah had to travel to Australia and get some kangaroos and koalas? Followed by a chuckle or two.
Dude, if you don't want us to laugh at it, you shouldn't make it sound so funny. I don't know what you want me to do here.
But once again, let's start by checking to see what the biblical text actually claims before we make our analysis. In Genesis 6:20, we read, "Two of every kind will come to you to keep them alive." This verse contains a critical key concept in answering the question, because it tells us that Noah didn't have to set out and search or travel to faraway places to bring the animals on board.
And in Genesis 6:19, it says that Noah shall bring them into the ark to keep them alive. Now, you could argue that this only means he would invite them or maybe oversee them into the ark after they got themselves there. But you could also argue that the next verse that Calvin just cited is just describing them obeying his commands and coming to him there at the ark after he already rounded them up. Again, as is so often the case with Answers in Genesis' biblical arguments, this only makes sense if you start from the assumption that their preferred interpretation of their preferred version of the Bible is the only true way to understand this story.
Thinking it through, with the devastation a global flood would have wrought, the world map would have been completely different before the flood. There would have been no Australia, Iceland, or Africa, for example. None of the continents we have today. And on the basis of Genesis 1:9 and Psalm 104:8-9, there actually may have been only one continent in the beginning.
This dude just denied science so hard that he reinvented Pangea. It's like an anti-vaxxer saying that we should do away with vaccines and just expose people to a dead or weakened version of a virus so they can build natural immunity. He stupided in a circle all the way back to Pangea.
According to the scriptures, there was a call by the Creator. The animals were sent to Noah and simply arrived at the ark as if called by a homing instinct, some kind of behavior implanted in the animals by God. And presumably, they would have marched up the ramp all by themselves.
Notice that word presumably there. Once again, we're not talking about what's in the Bible. We're talking about what's technically not in the Bible, and how Calvin can massage that ambiguity to sound like reality. And when he can't make something sound like reality, we get what should be a shameful amount of special pleading like this.
Though this was probably a supernatural event, which means that it's one that we can't explain by our understanding of nature, when we compare it to the impressive migratory behavior we see in some animals today, it's easily understandable.
Just because it was magic doesn't mean it should be dismissed as magic. The only scripture that I can think actually supports this is Genesis 7:15, which says the animals went into the ark. And I'm assuming that because it says they went in and not that Noah put them in, that Calvin is taking that to mean that they did that of their own volition. But this part isn't really clear in the first place. Noah and the animals enter the ark at least 2 different times in this same chapter. But this isn't a Bible study. None of this gets you out of the reality that if these animals did indeed come from different parts of the planet, they would have been adapted for life in different environments, and they're still going to die when they're on the ark. None of this explains how different lineages have different levels of genetic diversity if they all came from one pair. There were 4 pairs of humans on the ark, so we should have significantly more genetic diversity than the other apes, who only came from one pair of ape kind or whatever. But the opposite is true. How does that work if mutations can't make new information? It doesn't solve the problem of how plants survived the flood. It doesn't solve the problem of how coral survived the flood. It doesn't solve the problem of how whales survived the flood. It doesn't solve the problem of how parasites survive the flood. It doesn't solve the problem of why some animals get a pass and other animals don't. It doesn't answer the question of where Noah was getting his drinking water or how he was breathing, given the sheer amount of biomass and waste in this massive boat with only one tiny window. It doesn't solve the problem of how anybody was breathing, given the fact that over 50% of the oxygen in the atmosphere comes from photosynthetic microorganisms in the ocean that would have been killed off by this rapid change in ocean temperature and salinity. It doesn't answer any of the other obvious scientific questions that I raised in either this video or this video, nor does it address the glaring weirdness that Noah had to bring 7 of every clean animal just so that he could sacrifice them later. Certain animals on this vessel weren't there to preserve their lives. They were there to keep them alive just long enough so that they could be killed properly later, and God could savor the sweet smell of burning flesh in chapter 8, verse 21. Not one bit of this video answers any of the questions that a skeptic would ask. It's just a dramatic retelling of Calvin Smith winning an argument against the shampoo bottles in his shower. This man does not know how to think like a skeptic. This entire video is just conjecture from Calvin being put forth as the literal gospel. I'm not a Christian by any means, but if I was, this would be beyond insulting. As for me now, it's just incredibly irritating.
We are still far from comprehending all the marvelous animal behaviors exhibited in God's creation. The migration of Canada geese and other birds, the amazing flight of monarch butterflies, the annual travels of whales and fish like salmon, hibernation instincts, earthquake sensitivity, and countless other fascinating capabilities of God's animal kingdom.
For the record, this is the exact same argument that they give for unicorns. Lots of animals have existed and we don't know them all. Rhinos have a single horn, so a single horn horse isn't that big of a stretch. And we shouldn't doubt the Bible just because we don't have any evidence, because the Bible is the evidence. It's literally the exact same thing, except now they're saying that some animals have these senses and behaviors that we don't really understand. So this was probably like that, and please just stop thinking about it. It's just so wild to me that this is the dude who's now going to turn around in another video and deny the single best supported theory in the history of biology, the thing that gives him the food and the medicine that he enjoys every day, based on a demand for impossibly extreme levels of evidence that I guarantee he still wouldn't accept even if they made sense.
But remember, answering the objection people pose against the account of the Ark should be dealt with according to what the scripture plainly says.
Which is why we've spent so much of this video talking about what it doesn't say and what assumptions we can draw from that. Like that Noah might have had access to advanced technology and might have hired skilled workers and might have worked for many decades and might have had all the animals called to him like old cartoon characters smelling a pie. Once again, I can't stress this enough. This is the Skeptics Beware video. All of my other videos about Answers in Genesis is critiquing their science. I thought for sure if I were to watch their most popular video, especially with a title like that, I'd have my work cut out for me. But we're this far in, and we're literally playing God of the Gaps with the Bible itself.
But what about dinosaurs? Were dinosaurs on the Ark?
Oh, here we go.
You see, when people begin to realize that the Bible's account of the Ark isn't as full of holes as they originally thought, they often begin to bring out their big guns of doubt, asking what they consider to be the toughest questions of all. And the topic of dinosaurs certainly looms large among them. We'll begin by going back to the biblical text. Now, the history of God's creation, told in Genesis 1 and 2, tells us that all land-dwelling creatures were made on day 6 of creation week, the same day God made Adam and Eve. Therefore, it's clear, without influence from sources outside of Scripture, that dinosaurs, being land animals, were made along with man. Besides, the description of the behemoth in chapter 40 of the book of Job, and of course Job lived after the flood and the dispersal of the animals from the ark after it landed, only fits with something like a sauropod dinosaur. So the close ancestors of behemoth must have been on board the ark.
They put so much of their critical thinking like on hold, but yet they still struggle to fit things that are patently obvious facts about the world, like the idea that we do have remains of dinosaurs. So like, how does that fit in? Like, it has to fit in somehow, right? So how are we going to fit that in? So you change the rules of the earth and you change the rules of geology and astronomy and everything else in order to make that stuff fit in. You create this world that doesn't follow any of the same natural laws that we know now. You have to throw your uniformitarian assumption out the window and just create something that's completely different. It's just not right. It makes no sense.
We also find many dinosaurs that were trapped and fossilized in sedimentary rocks laid down by the Great Flood. That is, in flood sediment.
Of course, because when you start from the presupposition that a global flood happened, all sediment must be flood sediment. And then that proves that the global flood happened. It's like they're reasoning in some sort of like a ring pattern, like an argument that relies not on evidence, but on itself to modify the evidence and then make itself seem valid, like a big old circle of bad reasoning, like they're reasoning in a circle, like some sort of circular way of reasoning. If only there was a term for that.
And from people groups around the world, widespread legends of encounters with what people refer to generically as dragons give another strong indication that representative dinosaur kinds survived the flood. And obviously, the only way this could have happened is if they were on the Ark.
I just want all the people who are still on the fence about this to just imagine for a moment how it would feel if I, as a biologist, talked down to you the way that Calvin does. Imagine if I told you that there weren't any dinosaurs 300 million years ago, and then they started showing up 250 million years ago, and the only way that that's possible is if they evolved, and that was my entire argument. Imagine if every justification for my claims was pulled directly out of On the Origin of Species, and I was constantly going back to that one book and telling you what Darwin must have meant, even if it isn't what he said, because that fits my interpretation of the evidence. Imagine if I tried to shoot down creationism by taking quotes from Calvin Smith and Ken Ham wildly out of context while offering no new evidence of my own. Would you believe anything that I was saying if that's how I was presenting my arguments? Because you shouldn't. I'm going to be very blunt here. I don't know about you, but if anybody treated me that way, I would assume that person thought that I was stupid. Because nobody who isn't either very young, not trained in critical thinking, or already at least 80% bought into this narrative would fall for something like that. Videos like this are for preaching to the choir and indoctrinating children, not convincing skeptics.
Of course, when speaking about dinosaurs and the Ark with people, you can almost see the questions tumbling around in their head and that inevitably come out. But what about how big they were? Even though the Ark was huge, could it really have housed giant dinosaurs? Well, juveniles of even the largest land animals wouldn't present a size problem, and being young, they'd have their full breeding life ahead of them.
These arguments are so bad and so repetitive that at this point, I feel like I could literally just respond to this entire video with clips from other episodes of Reacteria. Take it away, past me. It's moments like these that I feel compelled to just stop and remind everybody what we are and are not doing right now. We are not listening to a debate between two experts in the same field as they weigh the data and try to come to a better understanding about the natural world. We are not comparing two scientific theories on equal footing and with equal merit. What we are actually doing in this moment is listening to a grown man explain to an audience of probably mostly children that you can get dinosaurs on a boat, you just got to get them while they're young. Like, it's so important that everyone understand this is not a fresh new take on biology. This is Florida man builds floating exotic animal sanctuary. That's what we're actually talking about right now. Good gravy. It is depressing how well that fits.
And despite our fascination with the more giant types depicted in museums, popular movies, and books, most dinosaurs weren't very large at all. Most scientists agree that the average size of a dinosaur is actually the size of a bison. So many were smaller, and of course some were bigger.
Most scientists also agree on evolution and the age of the Earth, but who cares about that, right?
For example, God most likely brought Noah 2 young adult sauropods, like apatosaurs, or similar to what I knew of as a brontosaurus when I was a kid, rather than 2 full-grown sauropods. And the same goes for the elephant kind, the giraffe kind, and other animals that grow to be very large. However, there was adequate room for most fully grown adult animals anyway.
Oh, so it doesn't even matter if it's too small, because it's actually quite big, and you can fit all sorts of animals in there, but don't complain about the adult animals, because they were probably just brought in as baby animals, but they could have been brought in as adults if they wanted to, because the thing was actually quite big, and it took thousands of years for anything else to be quite as big, and really, it doesn't matter either way, because it could be big or it could be small. The point is the animals fit, and my dad can beat up your dad.
And as far as the number or different types of dinosaurs, it should be recognized that although there are hundreds of names for different varieties or species of dinosaurs that have been discovered, there are probably only about 60 to 80 actual different kinds. Think of them like many popular kids shows describe them. There's the long necks and the spiky ones and the sharp-toothed ones with beaks and horns.
That's actually the closest I've ever heard a creationist come to explaining what kinds are. And it's the funniest possible way that he could have explained it. Just think about it like a little kid. You know, you got the long ones and the spiky ones. You know how a child would think about it? That's how the creator of the whole universe thought about it too. You gonna finish that pickle? Then we get this part with Calvin reading verses about the flood, and then we get this next part, which we already saw in the video about shorts.
But how could a flood destroy every living thing? Well, the Bible makes it clear that Noah's flood was much more destructive than any 40-day rainstorm ever would be. When the scripture says that the fountains of the great deep broke open, earthquakes, volcanoes, and geysers of molten lava and scalding water were squeezed out of the earth's crust in a violent, explosive upheaval. So the earth was literally churning underneath the waters for about 5 months. Continental shifting was occurring until the mountains were lifted up into their approximate current places. There's still some residual mountain building and continental shifting occurring today as a result.
And now, get this, modern plate tectonics is the result of the flood. No evidence, no reasoning, just the flood happened and everything else happened because the flood happened. I just want to talk about science, and there's no science to review here. The whole argument is just, see this thing? That's because of God.
For those that struggle to understand how the flood could be so destructive, a quick internet search with keywords like flash flood reveals hours of footage of how utterly devastating moving water can be.
A simple internet search can also show you all the reasons why a global flood is impossible. How there's no evidence for it and strong evidence against it. But again, that's only if you go to websites that give full quotes from scientists.
Relatively recent local floods, volcanoes, and earthquakes, though clearly devastating to life and land, are tiny in comparison to the worldwide catastrophe that destroyed and reshaped the world that then existed, as 2 Peter 3:6 describes. Noah's flood accomplished what it had been sent to do.
Genocide.
All land animals and people not on board the ark were destroyed in the floodwaters, per Genesis 7:21-23. And the result was the billions of animals preserved in the great fossil record we see today.
Just to be clear, when he says destroyed, he means drowned, and crushed, and boiled. Even the babies, and the pregnant women, and the dogs, and the monkeys, and all the other things that couldn't have possibly done anything evil enough to deserve to die in such a painful and terrifying and genuinely insane way. That is the conclusion to a video that they think will convince all the skeptics out there. A video full of conjecture, assumptions, presuppositions, apologetics, and outright fabrications, all centered around the story of an unjustifiable slaughter of billions of helpless people and animals by an all-powerful toddler throwing an almighty temper tantrum over his own self-contradictory regret. That's the most watched video from Answers in Genesis Canada. And frankly, I'm glad it's something so awful. As we reach the end of the video, I think I've come to understand some things about Answers in Genesis. You see, I've been watching and reacting to their content for a little while now, and in my various videos about them, I pointed out a few patterns of behavior that I've noticed along the way. Now looking back over these videos, I think I've finally hammered out a good summary of their overall strategy, which I've narrowed down into 5 points. Number 1 is partial quotations. They know that science is wholly against them, so they chop up quotes from real scientists to make it sound like the people who study and teach evolution for a living don't really believe in it, or that they're secretly creationists, or that they're secretly racist like they did with Stephen Jay Gould. No matter what they're trying to convince you of, if they're quoting a scientist to make their point, you can be sure that they are only showing you a piece of that quote, and that the full quote means something completely different. Number 2 is emotion over evidence. While over the course of my videos I've certainly never been afraid to point out the sinister past and awful implications of religious belief, I've also directly addressed the bogus claims made in their videos and detailed out real evidence for evolution. But they never grapple with real science. Instead, they just default to things like racism and eugenics and genocide to try to elicit a visceral response and pretend like religion, especially their religion, doesn't have the same dark history. Whereas evolutionary theory has more than clearly established that there is no such thing as superior genes or superior races or races at all, Answers in Genesis still holds to the belief in a golden past with a superior people, and that is a terrifying philosophy. Number 3 is non-existent animals. Remember, these are the people who believe in dragons and unicorns and talking donkeys because these things are in the Bible. And Answers in Genesis isn't allowed to believe that things like folk tales or translation errors are possible in the Bible. For example, as I pointed out before, the word that's translated to dragon in English is actually 2 different words, one in Hebrew and one in Greek, neither one of which mean anything close to a large, flying, fire-breathing lizard, and certainly nothing close to dinosaur. But that's what Answers in Genesis pictures when they think of dragons, so they assume that's what the Bible must be talking about. And then they use dinosaurs to fill the evidentiary void that that claim creates. Number 4 is inconsistent scientific standards. They constantly push the idea that science is dogmatic and untrustworthy, but they're more than happy to accept science when it looks like it might fit their biblical narrative, or more commonly, when they can twist it to do so. Like they did in my last video about them, where they claimed that a dinosaur in England was evidence of a dragon in Libya. Or in this video, where they claim that there's strong scientific evidence of genetic degradation, or that most scientists agree that most dinosaurs could fit on a boat, or any time that they misrepresent a famous evolutionary biologist who is suddenly no longer a lying shill from the cult of Darwinism, but someone who is honest and well-educated and should be taken very seriously, because it sounds like they might be agreeing with creationism. And finally, number 5, strawmen everywhere. They know they can't convince you that biology is wrong if they present it properly. So they misrepresent it in the most outlandish ways possible so that people who are ignorant of science coming into their videos will remain ignorant coming out of them. They need you to believe that all us scientists are just out here believing in ridiculous fairy tales so that you'll ignore the fact that they literally believe in ridiculous fairy tales. And I'm not even talking about the Bible there. Remember the whole dragons thing? They have a statement on their website about how all the fairy stories about knights in shining armor slaying fire-breathing dragons are at least partially true. So those are the 5 key strategies of Answers in Genesis. Partial quotations, emotion over evidence, non-existent animals, inconsistent scientific standards, and straw men everywhere. And to make sure that they can never fool anyone else, I hope you'll help me remind people that this is how they operate. This is what Answers in Genesis is all about. I want to make sure that from now on, anytime anyone talks about or even thinks about Answers in Genesis, this is what they think of. I've been trying all day to come up with some sort of a mnemonic device to remember this by, maybe Snipe, S-N-I-P-E. I don't know, that doesn't really fit their vibe. I can't think of anything, so maybe you can help me out. Just take some time to really think long and hard about this, and then let me know down in the comments if you have any ideas for any particular word that uses these letters that you think really resonates with Answers in Genesis and who they are as an organization. As for this video, I give it a science teacher challenge level. How do I even rate this out of 10? It's just a bunch of claims with no evidence, which is a wild way to structure a video titled "Skeptics Beware, This Will Change Your Mind." Like, I know I brought that up several times over the course of this video, but I was really hoping that the bomb would drop eventually, and it just never did. It just fizzled over and over and over, and now here at the end, I'm just disappointed. This video ended up being slightly different than my usual fare. I decided that it would be a fun challenge to watch their most popular video, and it turned out to have no real science to teach, so that feels kind of empty. I don't know, like, my most popular video is the first episode of Reacteria, and I certainly wouldn't want to be judged by that video alone. I definitely think I've grown as a content creator since then, but in all fairness, I've watched plenty of Answers in Genesis videos, and even though this one didn't have a lot of science in it, or any really, it wasn't any more or less compelling than any of their usual videos. This one just had more baseless assertions and less egregious lying than usual. whatever. I'll do my best to find a way to make more science-specific content soon, even though I know that my best science videos never get like 1/10 of the views that my worst Reacteria does. I just want to teach cool stuff, and this video blew, and I'm gonna have to make up for it somehow. Next year, I'll be going to Zimbabwe and Costa Rica to learn some cool stuff about the local biology, so if you want to come along for those, be sure to use the link down in the description to sign up for that. I'm also still planning on releasing the summer road trip video and the Borneo video very soon. Life has just been a lot busier than usual lately, and I was already spread pretty thin before, but I promise I am doing my best to get everything out before too long. Between this and conventions and live shows and classes and everything else, it's getting to the point where I'm starting to think that I might need to hire like an editor or something, and that's really saying something. So far, the only thing that I have outsourced is my thumbnails, and that took some serious convincing. In any case, your subscriptions and your memberships and your patronage and your views are what make this dream a reality, and I can never thank you enough for it. So with that, I'm Forrest Valkai. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and all the other stuff you do here on YouTube. Please exit through the gift shop, pick up one of these sweet t-shirts, have an awesome rest of your day, and never stop learning. Bye-bye.